There are moments in politics that don't just go viral, they break the script. And Zohran Mamdani's latest pro-Palestine speech did exactly that. Overnight, it sent a shockwave through every corner of right-wing media. Not because they disagree, they always do, but because, for the first time in a long time, someone inside the system said what millions outside the system have been screaming for years, that American foreign policy has a moral cost, and real people are paying it. Within hours, conservative commentators were scrambling. Headlines calling him dangerous, radical, anti-American. But here's the real question nobody wants to answer. Why did one speech trigger this level of panic? What truth did it expose about our politics, our alliances, and the people who claim to speak for American values? This video breaks down exactly what happened, and why this moment matters far more than the outrage machine wants you to notice. When Zohran Mamdani stepped up to the microphone that day, nobody expected the room to shift. Nobody expected the temperature to drop. And nobody, especially not the loudest voices in right-wing media, expected a speech from a state legislator to ignite a national firestorm. But that's exactly what happened. And it happened for a very simple reason. Mamdani didn't speak like a politician. He spoke like a human being, a citizen, a witness to injustice who finally decided that silence was no longer an option. And that alone was enough to throw America's outrage machine into full meltdown. The moment the first sentence left his mouth, you could feel a different kind of energy settle over the room. His voice wasn't dressed up in diplomatic language or the usual both sides moral fog. It was direct, painfully direct, the way people talk when they are tired of watching suffering turned into political theater. He talked about Palestinian families not as statistics, not as foreign policy concerns, but as parents, children, neighbors, human beings living through the kind of violence that America would never tolerate on its own soil. That alone broke the script. Because Washington, Albany, Sacramento, all of them, have learned how to talk about war without ever mentioning the people trapped beneath it. Mamdani refused to play that game. And you could see the reaction immediately. The room stiffened. Lawmakers who usually enjoy hearing themselves speak suddenly went quiet. A few shuffled papers, some looked down. Others stared straight ahead like they were trying not to appear visibly uncomfortable. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was recognition. The recognition that someone just said out loud what millions have been thinking, posting, and screaming into the void for years. And that is precisely why the speech resonated instantly when posted online. Within minutes, the clip spread across TikTok. Then Instagram. Then X. Not boosted by bots, not pushed by party machines, but shared by ordinary people across political, racial, and religious lines. The comments all said the same thing. Finally someone said it. Why doesn't anyone else talk like this? This is basic humanity. That's the part the media missed. It wasn't viral because it was pro-Palestine. It went viral because it was pro-truth, pro-decency, pro-humanity. And in a political environment where language is sanitized to protect powerful interests, that kind of honesty is explosive. But here's what really scared the right-wing commentators. The speech didn't read as partisan. It didn't sound like a progressive rallying cry. It sounded like common sense, the kind of moral clarity you hear from regular Americans sitting at their dinner tables, not from elected officials. Mamdani didn't point fingers at Republicans alone. He didn't make it a red versus blue spectacle. He called out systems, not parties. He spoke to people, not voters. And when you cut through the political noise, something remarkable happened. The public listened. But right-wing media couldn't let that stand. Because once a message like that escapes the usual political boundaries, once it becomes a human story instead of a partisan argument, their entire playbook becomes irrelevant. They can't attack empathy. They can't smear grief. They can't out-debate moral clarity. So they did what threatened institutions always do when exposed. They panicked. And that brings us to the real question, the question that opens the door to the rest of this story. Why does a simple call for accountability terrify the very people who claim to defend American values? Because the next chapter reveals exactly what they are afraid of, and why one speech was enough to expose the cracks underneath an entire political narrative. If you want to understand why right-wing media reacted like Zohran Mamdani sounded an air raid siren inside their studio walls, you have to understand how their ecosystem actually works. This isn't a marketplace of ideas. It's a fortress, a tightly controlled narrative machine where every topic has a correct position, and anyone who breaks that script becomes an immediate threat. This is why Mamdani's speech wasn't treated as a moment of moral clarity. It was treated as betrayal, heresy, deviance from the approved narrative. Because in that world, the rules are simple. Any criticism of Israel, any acknowledgement of Palestinian suffering, is instantly labeled anti-American. It doesn't matter whether the speaker is Jewish, Muslim, Christian, secular, conservative, or progressive. The moment you question US foreign policy toward Israel, you get dropped into the same bucket of slurs and buzzwords they've been using for decades. And they wasted no time deploying those labels against Mamdani. Anti-Semitic, terrorist sympathizer, radical leftist, unhinged socialist. It's the same recycled vocabulary they use against anyone who refuses to treat foreign policy like a sacred text. The words don't even describe what he said. They describe the fear his words created. Because here's the truth, their panic was emotional before it was political. Mamdani is not some fringe activist they can ignore. He's young. He's articulate. He's data-driven. He speaks calmly, factually, with the kind of moral clarity that resonates with a generation that's tired of being told to ignore what they can see with their own eyes. Right-wing media has spent decades shaping foreign policy opinion through fear. But this generation wasn't raised on TV. They were raised online, on raw footage, live streams, open-source journalism, and first-person accounts from Gaza that bypass traditional gatekeepers entirely. So when they see a politician who speaks the same moral language they do, someone who refuses to sanitize war, they don't hear radical leftist. They hear truth. And truth is the one thing the old narrative machine cannot survive. That's what triggered the panic. Not the speech itself, but who it resonated with. Because if American youth believes Palestinians deserve basic human rights, the entire decades-old foreign policy consensus starts cracking. Billions in military aid, lobbying influence, political careers built on hawkish rhetoric, all of that becomes unstable. So this wasn't ideological disagreement, this was self-preservation. Behind every angry headline, every Fox News segment, every his dangerous rant, there's a deeper psychology at work. Fear of losing control. Fear of losing the narrative. Fear of losing unquestioned loyalty to the U.S.Israel alliance that has gone unchallenged for generations. When Mamdani spoke, he didn't just challenge policy, he challenged the emotional foundation of that policy. The idea that America must always support Israel unconditionally because that's what we've always done. But people don't accept we've always done it this way anymore. Not when they are watching live streams of bombed hospitals. Not when they are scrolling through footage of families running from rubble. Not when the human cost is no longer invisible. And that's what terrifies the establishment media. Not Mamdani's words, but the fact they were heard. Because there's a difference between outrage and panic, and what we witnessed was panic disguised as outrage. Their reaction wasn't confident. It wasn't strong. It was defensive. A reflex, like a system suddenly realizing its grip on the story is slipping. And this raises the next pressing question. If one speech caused this much fear, what deeper power structure was Mamdani actually threatening? To understand why one speech rattled Washington, media outlets, think tanks, lobbyists, and political strategists all at once, you have to look beneath the surface. Because Mamdani didn't just speak about Palestine. He cracked open a conversation that threatens an ecosystem built over decades, a system designed to appear unshakable, inevitable, almost sacred. For more than 40 years, U.S. support for Israel hasn't been a policy, it has been a doctrine. A bipartisan commitment upheld by presidents from Carter to Biden, enforced by Congress, polished by think tanks, funded by powerful lobbying groups, and normalized by generations of career diplomats. Democrats, Republicans, it never mattered. On this topic, they walked in lockstep. Look at the historical trail. In 1995, Congress passed the Jerusalem Embassy Act with overwhelming support, a bill that symbolized total alignment with Israel's geopolitical agenda. In 2016, under Obama, the U.S. signed a record-breaking $38 billion military aid package to Israel, the largest such package in American history. And year after year, lawmakers from both parties rubber-stamped billions in additional assistance, weapons transfers, and intelligence cooperation. This wasn't charity, it was a political machine. A system reinforced by lobbyists like AIPAC, by hawkish think tanks pushing strategic partnership, by donors who tied campaign money to foreign policy obedience, and by media figures who framed every conflict as a morality play with America on one side and terrorists on the other. This is the power structure Mamdani walked straight into. And he disrupted it in the most dangerous way possible. He reframed the conversation from geopolitics to morality. Washington can debate regional stability. It can debate counterterrorism strategy. It can debate mutual security cooperation. But it cannot debate dead children. It cannot debate demolished neighborhoods. It cannot debate human beings being stripped of dignity and freedom, because morality collapses the political distance. When Mamdani spoke, he didn't say anything new. He just said what no one inside the system is allowed to say out loud, that U.S. tax dollars fund weapons used in the occupation. That American-made bombs fall on civilian neighborhoods. That surveillance technology developed in conflict zones is later exported around the world. He connected the dots that the political establishment prefers to keep scattered. And by doing that, he exposed a massive gap between American citizens and American policymakers. Because the public sees this conflict through a moral lens. But policymakers see it through a transactional one. Alliances, arms deals, diplomatic leverage. Mamdani forced those two worlds to collide. And when truth confronts power, power reacts predictably, it smears. It isolates. It discredits. Not because it is strong, but because it is fragile. This is why the backlash felt coordinated. It wasn't just media outrage. It was the system protecting itself. Lobbyists panicked because the younger generation is skeptical of foreign entanglements. Donors panicked because their influence depends on silence. Politicians panicked because once voters start asking moral questions, the old excuses fall apart. The establishment isn't afraid of Mamdani's ideology. They are afraid of his clarity. They are afraid of a narrative they can't control. They are afraid that once Americans understand how deeply their tax dollars are tied to injustices abroad, the entire foreign policy consensus could collapse. And so the reaction wasn't just anger, it was survival instinct. A reflexive attempt to preserve a multi-billion-dollar geopolitical narrative machine that has operated unchallenged for generations. But here's the real twist. Mamdani didn't even intend to attack that machine. Yet his honesty, his refusal to speak in euphemisms, did exactly that. And in the next chapter, we'll look at what happens when the public pushes back against that machine, and why ordinary people, especially young Americans, became the unexpected force that the establishment never saw coming. If the establishment thought Mamdani's speech would quietly disappear under the weight of media outrage, they miscalculated. Because something remarkable happened the moment the clip hit the internet, young Americans showed up. And they didn't show up quietly. The reaction was immediate, emotional, and overwhelmingly supportive. Gen Z and millennials, the generations raised not on cable news but on live streams, citizen journalism, and unfiltered footage, recognized something the media desperately hoped they wouldn't: that the outrage being manufactured on TV had nothing to do with truth. In fact, the contradiction was so obvious that it triggered something deeper: anger. Not anger at Mamdani, anger at the people trying to distort his message. Under the speech, hundreds of thousands of comments poured in. Young people saying, "This is what leadership looks like." He said what we've all been trying to say. Why is the media lying about him? This wasn't fringe activism. These were regular voters, students, young professionals, parents, people who have watched the images coming out of Gaza for months and refuse to pretend they don't know what they are seeing. And the numbers back it up. Poll after poll, from Gallup, Pew, and Data for Progress, shows the same trend. Sympathy for Palestinians has been rising sharply among Gen Z and millennials, while blind trust in the U.S. foreign policy establishment continues to erode. For the first time in decades, younger Americans are more critical of the Israeli government than they are supportive of it. That shift didn't happen by accident. It happened because the internet bypassed the gatekeepers. Right-wing media, stuck in a 1990s worldview, underestimated that. They believed that if they shouted loud enough, people would simply accept their talking points. But the era of one-way messaging is over. People fact-check in real time. They cross-verify videos, statements, and claims within minutes. They watch raw footage, and the public's conclusion is simple: if what they are seeing doesn't match what the media is saying, then the media is lying. That's why Mamdani's speech didn't feel like politics. It felt like truth. It felt authentic in a system where everything else feels scripted, from congressional floor speeches to cable news outrage segments. His tone wasn't partisan. It was human. And in a political environment built on performance, authenticity becomes a form of rebellion. Even moderate voters, people who don't follow foreign policy debates, who aren't activists, who don't identify with movements, found the backlash disproportionate. They watched the clip and asked themselves, wait, that's what they're calling radical. The media's reaction revealed more about their own bias than it did about Mamdani's speech. Because when the establishment calls empathy extreme, the public begins to question the establishment's moral compass. And here's the deeper truth: moral clarity always beats propaganda in the long run. You can't berate people into ignoring suffering. You can't shame them into accepting war. You can't demand they unsee what they've already watched. The more the media attacked Mamdani, the more people rewatched the clip. Not because they agreed with every word, but because they recognized honesty in a place where honesty is rare. That's why the backlash grew into something bigger than any single speech. It wasn't just people defending Mamdani. It was people rejecting the entire framework being imposed on them. Rejecting the idea that morality must be filtered through politics. Rejecting the idea that empathy is partisan. Rejecting the idea that questioning foreign policy makes you disloyal. By the end of the week, it was clear: this wasn't a backlash to the media. It was a rejection of an entire narrative structure, a system that no longer knows how to speak to the people it claims to represent. And in the next chapter, we'll zoom out even further to show what this moment reveals about America's larger moral identity crisis, and why the establishment fears that conversation most of all. If you strip everything else away, the headlines, the outrage, the pundit panels, the smears, what remains is the most important part of this entire story. This moment isn't about Mamdani alone, or Palestine alone, or right-wing media alone. It's about America. It's about who we are, and who we're becoming. Because what unfolded after Mamdani's speech speaks to a much larger crisis, a crisis that's been building under the surface for years: America's moral identity crisis. A nation that calls itself the champion of freedom, democracy, and human rights is suddenly being forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that its foreign policy does not always align with its moral self-image. And young Americans are no longer willing to look the other way. There is a generational moral awakening happening in real time. And it's powerful. You can see it on campuses, in polling data, across social media, and in the conversations people are finally having openly. This generation demands that foreign policy be rooted in humanity, not in military contracts or strategic alliances that ignore suffering. They want consistency, not selective compassion. They want a foreign policy that reflects the values America claims to stand for, not the interests of defense contractors, lobbyists, or political donors. And institutions know exactly what that shift means. It threatens industries worth billions. It exposes decades of bipartisan policies shaped not by morality, but by geopolitical convenience. It challenges political careers built on unwavering hawkishness. It also disrupts foreign lobbying networks that have influenced Washington for half a century. When a speech like Mamdani's goes viral with the younger generation, the establishment doesn't see one politician speaking out. They see the beginning of a collapse in public consent, the foundation on which their power rests. That's why the backlash was so intense. Not because his words were dangerous, but because the response to his words revealed a deeper fear. What happens when Americans stop accepting silence as policy? What happens when the public begins to question the moral contradictions? What happens when a superpower's citizens refuse to support injustice simply because it's happening far away? These aren't political questions. They are existential ones. Because a superpower is not defined by its military, it's defined by its conscience. And right now, America's conscience is divided. On one side, you have the old political class, driven by Cold War logic, military alliances, lobbyist influence, and the belief that national interest always outweighs human suffering. On the other side, you have a new moral conscience, a generation raised on transparency, eyewitness footage, global awareness, and a sense that power without humanity is not strength but downfall. These two visions of America cannot coexist forever. One of them will define the next century. And that is why Mamdani's speech feels like more than just a moment. It feels like an inflection point, a shift in public consciousness, a sign that America is re-evaluating not just what it does in the world, but who it wants to be. Because when the outrage machine attacked his speech, Americans didn't just defend